Doing well. Welcome to Dudes Talking, a special relationship with Recluse from VISUP.blogspot.com. Here with me, as always, is esteemed researcher and good friend Recluse, aka Steven Snyder. How you doing, brother?
Doing well, man. Thanks so much for having me back on Dudes Talking.
Anytime. We're just a couple of dudes, a couple of researchers, and a couple of dudes. I'm glad to have you back on. I want to thank you for sending me an early copy of A Special Relationship, and I read it, man, and definitely anybody listening, there'll be links in the show notes. Definitely pick yourself up a copy. I learned a lot. Recluse is an excellent writer. I mean, he's been writing blogs for 10 plus years at this point, at VISUP View, and this is his second book. Of course, his first book, Strange Tales of the Parapolitical. I also own a physical copy and a digital copy. Excellent book. So, yeah, definitely pick up, both books while you're at it. But, so, where do you want to begin first to discuss your book, A Special Relationship, Trump, Epstein, and the Secret History of the Anglo-American Establishment, Book 1?
I got the idea to start writing it, unsurprisingly, kind of towards the end of the summer last year after the whole Epstein thing had started to heat up. I had, of course, written a couple of blogs going into the ties that I had seen to Perfumo and some of the families. And the more I looked into that, it just seemed like it was such a fascinating topic. So I decided, why not write a book? I might as well, have all this information out in one place for people. Of course, it had originally I'd only planned on doing it as a single book, but I think after finishing like the introduction and the first two chapters, it was already up to like 30,000 words or something like that. So I was like, if I try to do this as a single book, it's going to be rivaling like War and Peace and Tragedy and Hope or something like that. So in the interest of hopefully making it more readable to people who haven't spent their entire lives, tracking down this kind of information like you and I have. I broke it up into 3 parts, and hopefully that will make it a little bit more digestible to the general public.
Yes, you didn't want it to end up being Rogue Agents in length, did you? Which is a good book, by the way, if you haven't read it on La Circula. So why don't we start with a few questions? I'm glad you gave a grand overview of what brought you to write this book, and I actually knew that you've been writing your books on Epstein and Trump for a while now, and the connections to the Anglo-American establishment as well. I am glad that you're bringing this to the forefront, and you bring in your research, because I think it'll be a different view than the other people who have written about Epstein in the past. So
yeah, well, that was what I was kind of hoping for, especially in the sense that it's not going to just completely be fixated on Israel, unlike it seems like many of the other accounts that are forthcoming.
Yes, not that there isn't Israeli ties.
Yes, not to say that there isn't a significant...
And there's not numerous Israeli ties.
They're not the only game in town, though.
Yes. So why don't we begin? Can you discuss kind of like the beginning of the Anglo-American establishment and its foundations, as far as, I guess, from the early 19th century with Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, and how there kind of was a difference in the way that they looked at things militarily, because how we're taught when we get our conspiracy worldview education by the secret right. We're taught about just the progressive side, the liberal side, kind of like your Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg Trilateral Commission side, but there's more to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that was, it was actually kind of a bit of a late addition to the book, the whole thing with the introduction, but I thought it was sort of necessary to put some of the American geopolitics into perspective, even though my kind of principal focus was more the British system in this book. But it is a really fascinating topic, and you can kind of see how the 3 sort of principal strands of geopolitics have existed in the American system now for, close to a century. And when I say the three of them, they effectively are the globalist, internationalist kind of view of the world, which is the one, obviously, in the alternative media we're most familiar with. This is kind of all centered around your CFR, your Trilats, your Bilderbergs, and all that kind of stuff. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got the far right, that sort of grew out of the America First Committee, which I'll get to in a minute, and from there kind of became the major proponents of rollback throughout the Cold War. And then kind of in the center, you have the what we would sort of now think of as the neoconservative movement. These guys have sort of bounced back and forth between the two camps over the past century. So anyway, when you're talking about the neocons, I mean, really the first neocon, the sort of architect for all of this was Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, the storied American president. So Roosevelt was a guy who really had an incredible vision for the United States. Effectively, he wanted to turn it into a major, power, a major world empire. And, this wasn't necessarily an uncanny vision, but I mean, he first and foremost really had an America-centric vision of this. And also, he was a president who was able to embrace the whole, kind of concept of manifest destiny and westward expansion, despite the fact that he came from more of that, rarefied New York social circles and that type of thing. Of course, kind of going back to the foundation of the country, there had always been this sort of dispute between whether the United States should have a closer relationship to Europe or should we continue the westward drive. The westward expansionist one had really been what had prevailed throughout much of the early 18th or 19th century. The Civil War kind of put the kibosh on that, and then you had the McKinley presidency, which really put the American empire first and forefront. McKinley was all about, continuing westward expansion. By this point in time, the West had been closed, so we had to venture into the Pacific to continue our goal to spread democracy or something to that effect. So yeah, Roosevelt was kind of one of the guys who saw this militant vision and one that could exist outside of the framework of the European powers, which was very crucial. And it would always be this sort of competing vision of internationalism. Of course, you had the kind of Wilsonian school that would grow to preeminence after Roosevelt's presidency. Of course, you had kind of the interim, the Taft presidency. Taft was much more closely aligned with what we would now think of as the far right. But Roosevelt's vision was continued through some of his close mentors and, or I should say successors, some of the people that he had kind of tutored. And the big one was Henry Stimson, who had been the Secretary of War under Taft, and then would later be brought back into government under FDR to be his Secretary of War. And Taft was really the guy who brought in, what we would now think of as the wise man clique into the U.S. government. These were John McCloy, Averell Harriman, a couple of the other guys. But I mean, he brought a lot of these people into the War Department during Roosevelt's administration, and this really formed the nucleus of what we would later think of as containment ideology, which was very much a kind of neoconservative viewpoint throughout much of the Cold War. Of course, at this point in time, though, these guys were Democrats, or at least they would become Democrats. Stimson was a Republican, though many of his proteges would end up being Democrats and quite prominent figures in the Truman administration. And then not quite as strong in the Eisenhower administration, but they did have a major resurgence in influence in the 60s during Kennedy's tenure. But ultimately, though, a lot of the successors of the wise men, I mean, most notably Peter Nitze or Paul Nitze, would basically become at the forefront of the neoconservative movement going into the 1970s. Of course, this was after there had been the division in the Democratic Party with the McGowan presidential run, I should say. But I mean, it was certainly kind of interesting how, despite the fact that the neocon movement is really It's never had a lot of power in terms of financial support or anything to that effect. It's always been more of an ideological current, or really a movement. But I mean, it's managed to wield, I mean, such a considerable amount of power. And I think that a lot of that kind of derives from the fact that these guys were able to bounce back and forth between these two sort of polarized worldviews with their own kind of unique version of internationalism, but certainly a much more America-centric version of internationalism.
Kind of like sitting on the fence. And so that they're able to bend to whomever's in power.
Yeah. And I mean, it's kind of interesting, I mean, obviously we hear about just the, extreme power of the New York financial circles and the CFR and all this kind of stuff. But when I was, really looking into this, going into the immediate post-war years when, I mean, there was a lot of traction being built up for the UN. And this was something that, really the Rockefeller clique and, I mean, a lot of the banking and financial interests were very much about. But it was really this wise man clique, even though they're often depicted by conspiracy theorists as being major handmaidens of the UN, this was not the case. And they were really the ones who sabotaged the UN structure more than anyone else. They just did not see it as being a reliable framework for combating communism. And, make no mistake about it, they were anti-communist, which again is another ridiculous construct that's been put up by the conspiratorial right over the years. But no, I mean, these guys were really the ones, first and foremost, who really did subvert the UN structure really in the cradle effectively and laid the foundation for this just massive military power that the United States would come to possess, and which really arguably would become the major power structure in the country during the Cold War.
Yeah, and you talked about too that a lot of the conservative internationalists of the World War II era and afterwards were bonesmen.
Yes. I mean, that was another really interesting thing that I, turned up because, again, this is, another, most of our framework for Skull and Bones comes from Sutton, and Sutton, of course, is pretty much writing from a conventional conspiratorial school of thought, which tends to depict the Bonesmen as being part of some kind of communist conspiracy, which, again, is very problematic, especially when you look at the long-standing ties that they had to the Republican Party and really both of the different, kind of factions of conservatism. Of course, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War I just mentioned, was a bonesman, and many of the wise men that he brought into the War Department, the broader Foreign Service, were also bonesmen. But on the other side of the spectrum, you've got Robert Howard Taft, I believe. Was it Robert Howard or Robert Alfonso Taft? I believe that was his son, right? Of William Howard Taft. Yes, Robert A. Taft. Okay, so he was another bonesman, but I mean, during the lead up to the Second World War, he was very much in the isolationist camp. And his father before him had been a major proponent of manifest destiny. I should probably point out here, when you hear the term isolationist brought up, it's complete nonsense. None of these guys were pacifists.
Yeah.
Their notion of isolationism derived from keeping the United States out of European conflicts. They
but
had
not their own conflicts, though.
Yes. They had no problem with conflicts in Latin America or Asia.
Yeah, interesting.
Wanted
I never
to go
thought of it that way. But yeah, you're right.
If you wanted to go invade, a country with brown people or yellow people in it, they were all for that. They thought that was a lovely ideal. Just don't get involved in, European struggles effectively. But yeah. So the whole thing with isolationism was just ridiculous. It was. And effectively, that was basically their whole opposition to FDR, at least in terms of foreign policy. It really did derive from their opposition to intervening in European affairs, i.e. in this case, Nazism specifically, which, most of these guys didn't have any major philosophical objections to. So you've got Taft, Bonesman, as the major spokesman for these guys. You go into the great debate after the Second World War, kind of at the onset of the Cold War, whether the United States would effectively continue the massive militarization of the nation that had begun during World War II. There were different schools of thought on this. The isolationists were somewhat reluctant to embrace this, and they were basically dragged into it. Or I shouldn't say dragged into it, but they were made amicable to this because of the Korean War and the fact that much of the U.S. foreign policy and militaristic thrust would be aimed at Asia in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So that was kind of the devil's deal, so to speak, that was made with them, and that effectively paved the way for just the massive amount of military intervention that we would have in Asia for the next quarter century or something to that effect. So, yeah. And it's, I mean, this really just sort of highlights the absurdity of this. I mean, you know, both the globalist and conservative internationalist cliques really didn't even care about Asia, and they had no really serious, they were not seriously committed to maintaining a U.S. presence in Asia and the mainland after, a certain amount of years. But they were more than willing to continue to send U.S. troops to die there for objectives that they had no intention of fulfilling, to say nothing of the, peoples of these countries who were subjected to the endless war, the degradation of their environment from, the napalm bombs and all this other stuff.
Orange.
Yes, all this other insanity. So, yes, we basically were more than willing to go through the theatrics of a drawn-out conflict in Vietnam and all of these other covert wars, and be assured there were many of them throughout the region, even though we didn't even seriously want to have a presence there. So, yeah, it's pretty disgusting in a lot of levels.
So Recluse, what were the three ways that the ideas that people had for foreign policy to handle the encroachment of the Soviet Union around the world and the spread of international communism during the Cold War?
Well, it was essentially the three, different factions. They had their own answers to it. As I've been kind of getting at, I mean, the conservative internationalists favored containment. Basically, we would try to hold the communist world into the borders that had been set not long after, the end of the Second World War, after the Chinese Revolution, effectively. At the other hand, but I mean, in the case of the containment militarists, they also wanted a robust U.S. military presence, and they did believe in militarily countering the communist world when they started to move outside of their designated sphere of influence, if you will. You had the globalist approach to it, which favored détente, peaceful coexistence with the communist world. They really wanted to demilitarize. And again, not because there was any kind of absurd communist conspiracy at play. They favored this simply because it would have, increased the amount of international trade. And international trade, as I'm sure you are aware, is the principal source of income for banks. This is what they get their loans for. This is what they make their money off of. So trade is a good thing. And also, to have trade, you need, peaceful coexistence. Lots of conflicts can be detrimental to trade. Yeah. I mean, you have them in far-flung regions of the world, that's okay, but you don't want major conflicts. That cuts into the bottom line, ultimately. So they preferred a somewhat more benevolent existence with the communists, though, again, it was really debatable how sustainable this vision was, and it really got the kibosh after the Carter administration, because it frankly was a disaster in many number of ways. And then finally, you had the great ideology of rollback. That was where we're going to go and turn back the communist revolution and destroy the Soviet Union, no matter what the costs. If we had to sponsor death squads all over the world to do it, that's what we were going to do. If we were going to sponsor genocides all over the world to go with those death squads, that's what we were going to do.
Leave behind Gladio networks.
Yes,
that's what we were going to do.
And in the really extreme cases, if we had to fire nuclear bombs at the Reds and engage in an exchange of nuclear weapons with them, that's what we were going to do.
So be it.
Sadly, it kind of seems like that latter perspective is the one that's increasingly started to prevail amongst many number of the factions now in the modern world.
Yes. So, Recluse, can you briefly go over the Committee on Present Danger?
Sure. Of course, there were, I think at this point in time, there's been 4 of the committees on present danger.
Yes.
So you had Mach 1, which came out, I think, around 1950, if I remember correctly. And this was essentially designed to sell the American public on the national security state in the first place. I mean, we had already made strides towards it, but it was going to cost a lot of money. The public was starting to become aware of how much the American empire was going to cost, and we needed a charm offensive effectively to convince everybody of the wisdom of this, including some of the financial interests at play. So that was the first committee of present danger, and it was generally more aligned actually with the Democratic Party at the time. Obviously, this would have been more the containment ideologues, but as I said before, they were more in the Democratic camp at this point in time. And you have some interesting guys in there. I mean, one of the big ones that you never really hear a lot about is Vannevar Bush. Is that how the first name is pronounced?
Vannevar Bush, which Mark from Housatonic Live, hats off to you. You've covered Vannevar Bush extensively on Housatonic Live. So
yeah. I mean, obviously, when you hear about this guy, it's pretty much always in relation to the UFO question and Majestic 12 and this other nonsense. And the fact is, with this particular Bush, he arguably did as much as anyone to enshrine the military-industrial complex into this nation. It is much his legacy as anyone's out there, to say nothing of just the absolute perversion of the scientific community, because he was the one who also advocated hitching them to the military-industrial complex to ensure a continuous stream of funding for scientific research. So yeah, you got almost an endless trough of funding from the DoD. Unfortunately, this also ensured that pretty much all scientific advances from the end of the Second World War onward have come through the prism of military use. So, yeah, everything, even the particular device that is enabling us to have this conversation, the internet, as we all know, began as a DARPA project.
That's correct. For military and science to work one together to share information.
Yeah. And that particular Bush was the guy who really laid the framework for all of this. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So anyway, that was Committee on the Present Danger Mach 1. Mach 2 emerged during the late 1970s during the Carter administration. And this, had some of the veterans, people who had been in the outskirts of the wise men clique, who had been generally aligned with the Democrats, but who had decided to throw in with the Republican Party in this era. So that's your Mach 2.
And with your Mach 2, real quick, you get a lot of the Council for National Policy involved in it, like John Peter Grace and Richard Mellon Scafee and Ronald Wilson Reagan and people within that next, or people even like Jeannie Kirkpatrick, United States Ambassador to the United Nations under Reagan, or William Casey, the former director of the CIA. So it's very much kind of a combination of everybody in the world order together, left or the right, in the second Committee on Present Danger.
Yeah, whereas the first one was more of a democratic-oriented body, as you're saying. I mean, the second one was definitely much more bipartisan, and really a lot of it, I think, was just driven by the revolt amongst much of the elite against the Rockefeller foreign policy, and certainly, really with the ascension of Richard Nixon, all the way up through Carter, the Rockefeller brothers, pretty much had a monopoly on foreign policy in the country with Kissinger and then Brzezinski. And yes, as I had alluded to before, it did not end well for the United States. The 1970s was not a good era for U.S. prestige in the rest of the world, to put it mildly. So, yes.
And I do want to mention about the first one real quick. Also, J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Oh, yes.
Was a member of the first Committee on Present Danger.
Yeah, it's, and I can again go back to it. It's important to point out that a lot of these, prominent scientists did play such a major role in enshrining the military-industrial complex. And that's something, again, obviously in the era of Trump, it is frustrating how science has been degraded. But on the flip side of the coin, we need to question the morals of scientists more and realize that, they are not impartial like everybody. They have their own agendas and so forth. And they are also as beholden to funding and the need for dollars as anyone else, which is another factor too that just is not considered, I think, a lot. When,
no, it's kind of like polarized to the extremes, right? You know?
Yeah.
Not, I mean, everybody here is a little bit more nuanced, obviously, but it's polarized to the extreme. You know, if you're more progressive, you're like, you know, you love science, you know, hashtag science, TM, you know. But then if you're on the right, it's like all science is bad, you know. And so not everybody's like that. I'm paraphrasing here. And in reality, science is corrupted, especially nowadays, with a lot of special interest groups and the funding that comes with it, and the lack of just adhering to the scientific method. It's a major problem. So.
Yes. So, and I mean, a lot of that, I mean, to my mind, really goes back to that first Committee on Present Danger and effectively where this decision was made by many of the leading scientists of that particular era to hitch their, you know, wagon effectively to the military-industrial complex. I mean, that has just had profound effects on how science has developed in this country and really by default in most of the rest of the world, because, I mean, we're really the engine for a lot of it. So, yeah, it's been disastrous, and that's something that really, I think, neither side, left or right, really takes into account when the debate over science is, you know, brought up in public. You know, we need to understand really what has been the force driving it and use that as the prism through which we view it through, quite frankly.
Yeah, and, you know, and since both sides are at each other's throats about it, you know, science can't go back to how hopefully it was previously done in the past with, you know, rigorous peer review and rigorous adherence to the scientific method.
Yes.
And that's gone now. it's in shatters, you know, and it's
yes, and I mean, and obviously, I mean, less of a philosophical bent. I mean, again, ultimately, science is a tool to measure and quantify the natural world, not an ideology, which is also something that's been forgotten in the modern era.
Yeah, very much so. And so, in the Committee on Present Danger 3 was...
yes, the Committee on Present. Okay, so yes, and then there was Mach 3 that emerged not long, I actually might have been a couple of years after 9/11, but effectively it was, you know, at some point in the early noughts, it was the anti-Muslim Committee Mach 3. The previous two had been the anti-communist ones. This was the anti-jihad, Muslim, Islam, whatever you want to call it, one. And then we have the current manifestation, the Committee on Present Danger Mach 4, which is anti-China. So I suppose maybe partly a revival, too, of the good old anti-communism of years past.
It is, and I've covered it on this channel, and I'll do more streams on the Committee on Present Danger China. But, you know, you got Steve Bannon, you got Frank Goffney.
Goffney, yes, I was going to say, he's the kind of link man. He was in the third one, the fourth one. He might have been in the second one. If he wasn't, he was at least a fellow traveler. He knew a lot.
He was not in the second one.
Okay. So, but he did know a couple of the people involved with the second one, certainly.
Very much in being a CMP member himself. So you got William G. Boykin. Oh, boy. Council for National Policy member and member of the Florida Priory of the Knights of Malta.
Yes.
You have the mentor to the PayPal Mafia, Rod D. Martin, Council for National Policy, and once a member of the inner circle of the CMP, which supposedly has disappeared, which was the Arlington Group. And you have Thomas McInerney, which is going around right now, pushing hammer and scorecard. Hammer time. So Thomas McInerney, of course, he wrote in-game, co-authored it with Paul Vallely. But I did a show on that. I'm not going to, discuss it much here, but definitely go back and look at my show on Hammer Time and Scorecard. You got James R. Woolsey, also a member of the Committee on Present Danger China. So, yeah.
Woolsey's another one of those guys that seems to always show up everywhere.
So, yep, keep going.
I think on if I'm not mistaken, I think on ISGP's website, he was like the most connected elite of them all, like just in terms of like membership and all these like different bodies and what have you.
Yeah, it's crazy. And of course, Steve Bannon also, I don't know if I forgot to mention Steve Bannon, and William J. Bennett, the former Secretary of Education under George W. Bush. and former drug czar. Was he Secretary of Education under Reagan? Yeah, Reagan. And then drug czar under Bush.
Do we still have the drug czar?
I don't know the answer to that. Do we still have a drug? Do we still have the national?
I mean, it used to be like, I remember back
yes,
when
we
I was
do.
a kid.
Yes, we do. We still have the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Where are you? Where are you?
Like, back when I was a kid, like in the 90s, it was like a big deal when the drug czar came out. Now it's just kind of like, do we even have the drug czar anymore?
Yeah,
like,
we still do. The current drug czar is Jim Carroll, whoever that is. So I guess
it's not as prestigious as it used to be.
I guess they're not doing anything about the opioids on the streets like they ever were, But it is what it is. So.
Oh my goodness. Oh. So, was there a Mercer family member in Mach 4?
Did I see? No.
That's a little disappointing.
You'd think there would be, but no.
Yeah, definitely.
There's probably some other people in here. If you really, if you really looked at the names, you'd probably be like, oh, I know that person. I'm probably missing a few people here, but it's just to beat the China war with China war drums, beat them. So. That's all it is. But, okay, so, on to the Profumo affair. I hope I'm saying that right. Can you briefly give us an overview of that?
Well, general gist of Profumo, most of the events relevant to Profumo unfolded in 1961, mostly had wrapped up by early 62, though the scandal didn't begin to break. A little bit of rumblings start to come out towards the end of 62, but it really wasn't until 63 when it really started to come out. But effectively, it revolved around a love triangle that included Yuri Ivanov, who was the Soviet military attaché and to the UK at the time, and also a agent of the GRU, the Soviet Union's principal military intelligence service, still the principal military intelligence service of the Russian Federation.
Which Michael Flynn was the first to visit the GRU.
Oh, really?
Let me see the age, not the age, the year that happened. Give me a minute. 2013. He was the first.
Wow. The GRU's been around for a while too.
He later be national security, but he was the first visitor to. He later, of course, become the national security advisor under Trump. But yes, he was the first under. I think he was under the Defense Intelligence Agency at the time, the DIA, but I could be misspoken. But he was the first to visit the GRU. So he was the first, U.S. officer to be allowed inside of the GRU. So.
That's interesting. But okay, so and then there was also John Profumo himself, who was a cabinet minister in the conservative government of Harold Macmillan, then the sitting prime minister. And finally, there was a showgirl named Christine Keeler. The triangle had got into effect at an estate called Cliveden in the summer of 1961. There was a party there. One of the guests of honor for this particular party was Lord Mountbatten, the uncle of Prince Philip. And certainly if you follow the Kincora Boys Home scandal from the 1970s, Mountbatten was a major figure implicated in that. And in general, he has been linked to the abuse of children for a number of years now. So
yes, he has
rather
been. Very tragically.
Yes. So rather appropriate, I suppose, in a sense that the shenanigans with Profumo started at a party honoring Lord Mountbatten.
Yes.
So anyway, Keeler, I believe, first had an affair with Ivanov and then later with Profumo. She only slept with Ivanov once, technically, though that's been disputed. Different times they claim that they didn't have sex at all. Sometimes they had more than that, but it's generally agreed it was once. And though she did have an ongoing affair with Profumo shortly thereafter that lasted several months. And for obvious reasons, this was a bit problematic because you now had a cabinet minister engaged in a woman who was also sleeping with a senior Soviet spy. Though Curiously, there was not much done about this for nearly a year, despite the fact that MI5 appears to have been aware of these developments very early in the game, and that's quite possibly because they were the ones who instigated them. The man who had really set this whole thing up was a quote-unquote society osteopath named Stephen Ward. Ward knew quite a considerable amount of VIPs in the British establishment and even a couple of American ones to boot. Ward also effectively ran girls for many of these VIPs. He tended to recruit teenage girls who could pass, or excuse me, women who were just barely legal, like 18, 19 years old, who could still pass for being teenage girls. He would, teach them what forks to use and generally how to behave in polite society, and would then bring them to his special friends. MI5 was aware of these activities, and so was MI6, and it's quite likely that MI5 thought that it might be useful to take advantage of Ward's services, possibly to entrap Ivanov, but also possibly Perfumo too. There are some interesting speculations about that. But regardless, it does seem that British intelligence was aware of these developments pretty early in the game, but didn't really become an issue until 1963. And, well, that's a big thrust of the book, essentially, is trying to examine the geopolitics behind that and why it suddenly became such a huge deal, why it was allowed to bring down the government of Harold Macmillan, and ultimately how John F. Kennedy was dragged into it.
Okay, I was going to ask Kennedy, but first let's circle back. Can you describe the Pilgrim Society, which is a major part of the Anglo-American establishment and one that is very, rarely talked about?
Yeah, and first off, we really need to give a big tip of the hat to the Institute for the Study of Globalization and Covert Politics. Joel is the one who really exposed the Pilgrim Society and Le Cercle, for that matter.
Very much so, yes.
For years, he was a lone voice in the wilderness, bringing light to these, and we should be eternally grateful to him, because these were really the two arguably central bodies during the Cold War amongst the elite.
Yes.
As for the Pilgrim Society, this was really the mother of all of the Anglo-American, kind of networks, if you will. It was founded, I believe, in the late 19th century. It predated Quigley's Round Table group.
Yep.
It was essentially an early version of that, trying to forge closer ties between the American and the British establishments, ultimately with the goal of potentially bringing the states back into the fold. This was, of course, an agenda that was later taken up by Quigley's Round Table group, but the Pilgrims were always much more conservative, though, than the somewhat more idealistic faction in the Quigley's group, like Lord Milner and that type of thing. But don't want to get too sidetracked. But yeah, certainly the Pilgrims, though, were just huge in these Anglo-American fellowship circles. A lot of major families had been involved in these groups for many generations. Of course, some of the people we've already addressed, most notably the Roosevelts, have been longstanding members of the Pilgrims. But
Rockefellers. Rockefellers too.
Another one, yeah. The Astor family, which is another one that shows up in just a lot of these shenanigans, has been a member of the Pilgrim Society since pretty much the beginning. So, a lot of these storied Anglo-American families that we've heard so much about, this was really where I think the initial ties were forged, was in the Pilgrim Society. And it still wields tremendous power, throughout this whole faction. It really has been for, at least a century or so, I would say, the most exclusive body for the Anglo-American financial interests, even more so than Bilderberg.
Yes, and so on ISGP studies with Joel, he also mentioned the connections to the Pilgrim Society to the Mellon family. And Cecil Rhodes. And the Windsors and the Rothschilds. So, very, very connected group that few people ever discuss. It's the Pilgrim Society, and I'm glad you wrote about it extensively in the book.
Yeah. And it was also, too, I mean, to give Joel some, props for that, too, because, I mean, he really did do a fabulous job. And it's an important topic. And, I mean, he also needs to get more credit for bringing it up, too. But certainly I knew when I started working on this, I was like, I've got to figure out a way to get the Pilgrims in there because, I mean, more people need to hear about this group.
Is it a possibility that Quigley, what he wrote with Tragedy and Hope, was kind of almost a limited hangout?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Because he either doesn't mention the Pilgrim Society at all in either Tragedy and Hope or the Anglo-American establishment, or if he does, it's in a very perfunctory, just kind of offhand, reference or something to that effect. But it's kind of like the same thing with the whole, concept he gets in there of the Cecil block, which is very good. But I mean, effectively, he argues that the Cecil block was almost totally subsumed by Quigley's Round Table group, I think by the 1920s or something like that. But that just is not the case. I mean, the Cecil family is still extremely powerful in the United Kingdom to this very day, whereas the Round Table group is basically defunct. I mean, even the, successor groups like the Royal Chapman House, whatever it is, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, I mean, their agenda now is pretty much totally devoid of what the Round Table group was originally constructed for.
Yeah.
But the Cecils are still going strong, though, I can assure you. So, yeah, I would say that Quigley was definitely... There is certainly some distortions of history in both of those books.
Real quick, Mark from Housatonic Live had a question. Recluse, have you ever came across any information on Stuart Symington III, who was the first?
How's the last name spelled?
Symington. He was the first Secretary of the Air Force in the Symington family, by chance?
Not off the top of my head, but if you send me the name, I'll look through it. Sometimes it's better when I can actually see them.
Yeah,
yeah.
Me too. So I'll definitely get back to you, Mark. Okay, so I'll show you where to go. So how does JFK play into with the Profumo affair, since it was, European and not American? So how does JFK, play into all this?
As you are certainly no doubt aware, JFK was quite the philanderer.
Tell me more. I would have never guessed that.
So, yeah, that would be the most logical way to explain it. Certainly, he did let his penis lead him around quite a bit, and it led him into the arms of not one but two of Ward's girls. One of them was an Asian woman, Susie Chen, I believe her name was, and then the other one was Maria Novikov or something like that. She was Czechoslovakian. But anyway, these affairs had happened towards the end of 1960, early 1961, when these girls were visiting the United States shortly after Kennedy had won the presidential election. Maria had actually been spirited away out of the United States when the FBI was beginning to close in on her, and she had long alleged that it was actually the CIA that helped get her out of the country, which was quite possible. The other one, Susie Chang, had also been given assistance from the law firm that William Donovan had been a long-time partner in. Of course, he was dead at this point in time, but several of the old OSS old boys who had worked with him were still in the firm. So, again, it seems like there was an awareness, especially on the part of Hoover's FBI, that there had been something going on with Kennedy and some of the girls that Stephen Ward had been running, but they weren't able to really get anything damning while the girls were in domestic soil. But then a funny thing kind of happened around the end, I think, of 61 or 62. An American private detective showed up in the United Kingdom named Thomas Corbally. Corbally is a very interesting figure. Came from a family that had been involved in private detective work for a while. Corbally also moonlighted sometimes as a spook and sometimes as a gangster. Probably sometimes all three at the same time. But anyway, Corbally started renting a flat out in London where he would throw orgies and so forth out of. And unsurprisingly, he eventually came into contact with Stephen Ward and became a dear friend of him, started pumping him for information. And when he was able to get to the bottom of what all had happened with some of the acts that Ward and his girls had gotten up to. So when Perfumo started to break, it was actually Corbally and his flatmate, William Mellon Hitchcock, who was a member of the infamous Mellon family of Pittsburgh, who were summoned by the American ambassador, David Bruce, who had been an in-law of William Mellon Hitchcock's at one point, to essentially figure out what all was going on if the allegations surrounding Macmillan's government were true. Of course, Mr. Billy and Corbally already knew that they were true since they had been palling around with Ward for about a year at that point in time, though in some accounts they did nonetheless go through with a meeting with Ward to, again, ask him specifically if the allegations were true. But regardless, these were the characters that had eventually confirmed this for David Bruce. Bruce then realizing that the head of the government of a major U.S. ally had been thoroughly compromised by Soviet spies, decided to do absolutely nothing with this information and effectively sat on it for several months. Then, as things started to break in the spring of 1963, Corbally departed the UK, and he made a beeline to the FBI in, I believe it was June of that year. And he came with his chief political mentor, and who was also working as his attorney, and that was a certain Roy Cohn. So these guys start giving the Bureau lots and lots of juicy information about what Corbally had found out, why he was in the UK, and apparently some of it is still classified to this very day. But it was very fortuitous. Of course, at this particular time, Hoover and Roy Cohn had both effectively been fighting for their political and, I guess in Roy Cohn's case, his legal life as well. Robert Kennedy had quite a vendetta against both of these two gentlemen, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
So certainly having this particular private detective dig up information about his brother potentially being involved in the sex ring that also involved a Soviet spy probably seemed like manna from heaven to these two gentlemen. So yes, that triggered an emergency meeting at the White House, I believe, and yeah, a lot of panic over what exactly would come out with Ward.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll ask some questions about Roy Cohn in a minute, even though I'm pretty sure they'll be discussed later on, more in depth in future books. I would assume, but the only thing I really have to add to people that you were discussing was that as far as Marion Petty is concerned, and of course the Finders Cult and everything. He was supposedly friends with Billy Hitchcock's private pilot. I'm trying to get his name. I'm trying to think of it. But yes, it's quite interesting. The various connections, all these people, when you start digging in, not all of them, but a majority of them, knew one another. And it's a Walt Schneider, retired naval intelligence officer, and
oh, it's interesting. British intelligence officer too, huh?
Yes, he was Timothy Leary and Billy Hitchcock's private pilot. So Petty had a good relationship with him. So to circle back to Roy Cohn. Now, Roy Cohn is, of course, Donald John Trump's mentor, among allegedly other things. And can you give us a little background on Roy Cohn real quick? And why he would be interested in getting, blackmail information?
Well, I mean, obviously, Cohn had, risen to prominence as McCarthy's chief counsel, and that was also effectively what had started the animosity between him and Robert Kennedy. It's not really talked about a lot now, but Robert Kennedy had wanted that particular gig for himself, but McCarthy had opted to go with Cohn because it was felt that he could maybe dodge charges of anti-Semitism if he had a Jew as his chief counsel, effectively. So, anyway, McCarthy crashed and burned, but Roy Cohn emerged largely unscathed, even though he and his homosexuality had probably been instrumental in McCarthy's downfall. He had, though, another patron by this point in time. In fact, he already had this patron by the time he had hooked up with McCarthy, and that was J. Edgar Hoover, of course, the longtime director of the FBI, which is very interesting in light of the fact that upon wrapping up his affairs with McCarthy, Roy Cohn returned to New York City and effectively became the attorney for the syndicate for much of the rest of his life. It's been my contention, specifically in this book, that a big part of why Roy Cohn was able to engage in just countless criminal activities, and rather blatantly for years and years at that, is because he was essentially the back channel between the FBI and the syndicate. Certainly, he had a very close relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, and he would have, in that capacity, been ideal to, effectively bring messages back and forth and that type of thing. So, and then, of course, there are some of the more, let's just say, saucy rumors floating around about Roy Cohn and J. Edgar Hoover involving a certain blue suite at the Plaza Hotel. That also involved teenage boys, and Hoover apparently appearing in drag. Yeah, so it would certainly seem to indicate, if this was the kind of thing that Roy Cohn had a certain knack for, he might have been drawn into the whole sexual blackmail racket. Certainly, Corbally is also a guy who appears to have been quite well, let's just say he seems to have had a nose for that kind of thing. Of course, Corbally was Roy Cohn's private detective for many, many years. He also worked for Donald J. Trump as well, and another figure who's really important in all of this, and that's Sir James Goldsmith. But Corbally, of course, okay, so he's there in the UK, in London, in the early 60s, digging up all this dirt on Ward and what was going on there. Towards the end of the 1970s, early 1980s, he again shows up in the rather raunchy scene that was unfolding in New York State, outside of the city, Long Island, these kind of isolated mansions out there, where there was apparently quite a prominent S&M scene that involved a lot of VIPs from New York City. It kind of gained some public exposure in 1980 over the whole incident with Monica Heller. She alleged that she had been raped and videotaped at a party that had been thrown at one of these mansions. It later came out that Corbally was one of the figures who had leaked this to the public, effectively because he was concerned by all of the amateurs moving in on this scene, which he naturally took credit for having established. So anyway, Radin, as I'm sure you guys know, would later show up in the Cotton Club murders. He was one of the people who would put up money to get the movie financed. Another one of the producers involved in that was Robert Evans, who was also a close friend of Thomas Corbally. Evans also shows up in another sex scandal that Corbally was involved with, and that was the one involving Heidi Fleiss during the early 90s. She was the Hollywood madam. She had a lot of the major VIPs in Hollywood at the time as clients, like Charlie Sheen and Jack Nicholson and so forth. Corbally was apparently the guy who came up with the money for her legal defense with the stipulation that she could not name any names if she took the money, which she apparently did not. So good for her, I guess. But anyway, so Corbally was a guy who shows up in these exclusive VIP sex rings in LA, in New York City and the surrounding area, and in London, over the course of several decades. He certainly seems to have had a knack for this type of thing, which strongly indicates that he was a pretty big player in it. And this was the guy who, for many years, was Roy Cohn's chief private detective. So that does raise some interesting possibilities when you get into all those allegations floating around for years that Cohn was a significant figure in sexual blackmail operations. Certainly his private detective does seem to have shown up in a lot of them.
Yeah, very much so. There was a question in the chat from Patricia. Who do you believe assassinated JFK?
Oh, God, you had to ask me that.
Yes, I did.
Let me see. What was the line from the movie JFK attributed to David Ferry? It's an enigma wrapped in a puzzle, wrapped in something like that. I think pretty much all factions of the establishment were really involved in the assassination, which is kind of something that I get into in the book. But I mean, really, a lot of people had reason for Kennedy to die, effectively. But I do think that the whole incident with Perfumo and what was it also the other one, Bobby Baker, I think, LBJ's good buddy who also was running Call Girls or something. Is that who I'm thinking of, John?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So anyway, it was a similar situation with that one as with Perfumo. One of the girls potentially had ties to Soviet intelligence. So you have Kennedy, who was very much a creation, the globalist faction, who had been ensnared in not one, but two sex rings linked to Soviet intelligence. And even though, probably at least in the case of Perfumo, I actually think that the Ivanov might have been induced in there deliberately so that it would be compromising by British intelligence, but that's another topic. But anyway, it was very frivolous, but regardless, this would have utterly destroyed Kennedy if it had come out publicly. I mean, the affairs with, actresses and things like that were one thing, but you get ensnared in something that could be linked to Soviet intelligence that, is just not something anybody would have overcome, especially in that particular era. And it wouldn't have just been JFK that went down, okay? It would have been everybody associated with his administration. Many of the globalists who had put him into power would not have come out of that unscathed, especially those who were closely tied to his administration. It would have been utter political suicide for everyone involved. So probably a lot of those people were not thrilled with Kennedy's actions, to put it mildly. So I think even within his own administration, some of the prior loyalists facing essentially career ruin because of Kennedy's actions probably opted to, at a minimal, look the other way. But certainly that's something that I get into more, just effectively how much all of these different factions really wanted Kennedy dead by that point in time. I really think to some extent that allowing Corbley effectively to come to the United States and unmolested and giving Hoover this information was an attempt by all of the major players to try and put pressure on Kennedy effectively to resign before some of this stuff started to become public. Obviously, that didn't happen, and that resulted in a bit of a house cleaning, let's just say, in November of that year.
I mean, who was involved in it? The mob, Israel. Who wasn't involved? I guess I should say the John Birch Society, American Anglo interests.
Pretty much by 1963, almost everybody had a reason to want
Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard. I mean, who wasn't involved?
I mean, the Kennedy brothers had definitely ruffled a lot of feathers. I actually think to some extent Robert might have even been more responsible for his downfall. RFK was quite vindictive, to put it mildly, and had definitely pissed off some pretty serious people. Again, going after Hoover, the mob, Gone. I mean, a lot of those guys would not take something like that laying down, to be sure.
Yeah, I am. Wow, I don't think Recluse, are you familiar with the King Kill 33 and the Masonic ritual involved with the JFK murder? Kind of like Michael Joseph's.
Yeah. I mean, the Michael A. Hoffman stuff.
No. But Michael Joseph's too, about how it was a ritual and as far as my possible belief that JFK was actually a willing participant to usher in the New World Order. Especially when you look in, everybody thinks that JFK was one of those presidents that's our guy, right? And I'm theorizing here. I'm not saying this is an absolute. But aren't we kind of told by that he's a martyr by the, CMP, JBS, truth movement? And then when you really, think about it, we're always taught, always given the line by Jim Mars about, he's fighting against the gold standard. But when you actually read, what exactly, what was an executive order? I have to look it up, the one for gold. I think it's executive order. I gotta remember exactly which one it is. But it wasn't really to get us off the gold standard, or to get, to strengthen, to get us off out the Federal Reserve and to strengthen the gold standard, what was left of it. And it was actually to reduce the amount of money that could be exchanged for silver certificates. So yeah, I think Jim Mars was obviously lying about that. And many people, Executive Order 11110, 11,110. That's the gold reserve one. So that, and him being very close to the Dulleses, and the Dulles family. Of course, many people think that Allen Dulles had a role in the Kennedy assassination, from kind of like getting payback from him being dismissed because of the Bay of Pigs debacle, right? But I've read things to the contrary, where Kennedy was still much good friends, because Kennedy's father was good friends with the Dulleses. And Kennedy, like, when, at the CIA, when, he's giving, Dulles kind of like a goodbye, like, celebration, he's talking about how much that he loves Allen Dulles, and how much their families are such good friends with each other and stuff like that and everything. So, I don't know. I don't really believe that none of the presidents have ever been really for us, including the Kennedys. So, I don't know how you feel about that. I know that's kind of a weird position for me to take when 95% of the truth movement thinks that John Kennedy was a martyr, was fighting for us. But
yeah, it's certainly a little difficult to kind of square with his personality. Kennedy really was very much a Hinduist. That's why I don't know if he would have also been a willing, sacrificial victim to usher in the New World Order. I don't think he was necessarily that altruistic, honestly. To some extent, I think that might have been more true in terms of actually being a genuine crusader with RFK. RFK always struck me as someone who had a certain degree of personal integrity. He did seem genuinely committed, for instance, to going after organized crime, though obviously selectively. He did know his family history in it, but possibly that was also what drove his desire to combat it.
But was it like Rudolph Giuliani, going after the Italian mob in New York City so the Russian mob could come in?
Well, it's hard to say, but Kennedy was also the one who really came up with the concept of the syndicate in the first place, which, up to that point in time when you had heard about organized crime, it was always depicted as an Italian thing. RFK was actually the one who had begun to acknowledge that there was also a Jewish element, in it.
Very much so, yes.
So, in a lot of ways, he actually also brought a much more sophisticated take into organized crime, that I think was much more accurate, and really is probably still much more accurate than the way they're often depicted, by official sources and so forth. Obviously, both of the Kennedy brothers were deeply flawed on any number of levels, but that's true of almost everyone, honestly, I think, who came from that background. But yeah, St. John is definitely hard to square with just, just honestly, if you look at the way he treated some of the women in his life, that in and of itself, I think, says a lot about his character, which, really was quite horrendous in some cases. But in the case of his brother, at least, I do think RFK did have maybe more of a conscience than many people from that type of background, though.
I don't know. I have opposing view. It's all that, but it's okay. We can have opposing views. We're not going to tear each other apart.
And I should point out too. I mean, RFK was also very, very vindictive. So it also kind of begs the question. I mean, how much of this was due to principle and how much of it was out of spite? I do think that there was a decent amount of that in some of his drives as well. So
I still can't rectify the Kennedys going after Scientology as hard as they did, but they did. They did.
Yes. I mean, that was another kind of odd thing. I mean, like I said, it's always difficult to really see where the Kennedy brothers fit in. I mean, obviously the kind of idealized perspective you get of the Kennedy brothers and much of the mainstream conspiracy community, I think, is very faulty on a lot of levels. Mm-hmm. But, there is some merit to it, though, on some levels, certainly.
Possibly. Maybe not. Is there anything else that you want to finish? Anything else that you want to discuss from a special relationship that I left out, or anything that you want to talk about?
Well, I think one thing certainly to point out, which I really get into in the early part of the book, was the British role in rigging elections here, which I think is certainly something that's very relevant, especially with our current situation right now. But I mean, obviously, the mainstream narrative is that we only really had this major influx of foreign powers trying to manipulate U.S. elections in the last decade or so, and that is complete and utter nonsense. Certainly, I think that there was a presence even before the Second World War, but I mean, going into the Second World War, I mean, the British just absolutely pulled out all of the stops to manipulate the United States into that conflict. And yes, I mean, it was to stop Nazism, and that is, I think, really covered up a lot of these abuses for years, because, I mean, if it had been virtually any other conflict, there probably would have been far more outrage over it. But I mean, the guy who really ran this operation for the British was Sir William Stevenson, intrepid, the head of the British Security Coordination, which oversaw pretty much all of the UK's intelligence in North America during the war. And I mean, this guy really wrote the book on all the stuff that, you hear the truth community complain about ad nauseum to this day. Rigged polls. That was Bill Stevenson. In fact, he had one of the major figures in Gallup who had really defined a lot of the polling in that era. Hiring fake protesters to harass politicians. That was Bill Stevenson. Using women to ensnare sitting U.S. senators to vote a certain way for foreign power. That was also Bill Stevenson. I mean, he really had all the tricks at his disposal for that type of thing. So I think that's, something that we really need to go back and look at and understand just how much of modern American policy has been manipulated. Mm-hmm. And, certainly by foreign powers, and not necessarily the foreign powers that we are often told that we need to worry about. You'll hear endlessly about the Russians and the Chinese and so on and so forth. But the bottom line, folks, Putin or whoever the head of the Chinese Communist Party is not going to be invited to address our Congress anytime soon.
Xi Jinping.
But, the Prime Minister of Israel and the Prime Minister of the UK will always have a standing invitation, though.
Oh, so you mean Bojo and Bibi Netanyahu? So.
Yes.
Yeah, of course, Bibi was awarded by Trump the key to the White House. Oh, boy. So that was a very interesting ceremony that happened this time.
I'm sure they've got something nice in store with Bojo if Trump does prevail,
I guess we'll see. I guess Bojo the turncoat, huh?
Well, they're brothers in COVID now, so, I mean, that's got to count for something.
Yes, it does. Well, definitely, purchase Recluse's book, A Special Relationship. The links will be in the show notes. It's an excellent book. Can you give us a little peek into part 2? Real quick, what part 2 is going to cover, real quick, if you don't mind?
Oh, yeah. Well, part 2, we're really going to get into a lot of the stuff with Lissar Cow and so forth. Of course, a pivotal figure in the first one is Joanne LBRY. the infamous British coup master and longstanding member of the House of Commons. Of course, he later became the chairman of the SOCAPO in the 1980s. But yeah, that's going to be used as sort of the framework for stretching out how these different blackmail operations were kind of being run across much of the world by the 1970s.
Yes. And I'll be looking forward to that too as well. Well, thank you for coming on, Recluse. We'll have you on again, brother, in the near future. And definitely go check out Recluse's website, visupview.blogspot.com. His podcast, The Farm, which you might see me, yours truly, on there occasionally, and me and Lee have also done an episode on The Farm as well, and sometimes I repost some of our streams that you thank you for allowing me to do so, Recluse. On here.
Actually, we're gonna be recording one tomorrow, actually.
Yes. And also to purchase your book, both your books, both Special Relationship, Trump Epstein, The Secret History of the Anglo-American Establishment, Book 1, and Strange Terrors of the Parapolitical. Yes. All right, everybody. Take care. Have a good evening. And do your best out there. God bless everyone.